Good morning. We are very grateful to have all of you here this morning, and I want to especially welcome one of our newest members, our perhaps fluffiest member, Husky, sitting back here with the Andrews. Husker. Very glad to have Husker with us this morning. There he is. Welcome. We'll have to swing the camera around and do a close-up on him. Last Sunday morning, a toddler settled into his pew, just 2 or 3 rows behind where Kendra and I were sitting. And I overheard this toddler whisper very loudly to his parents, "Why are we here?" Now, I don't know how the parents responded because immediately after that, the next worship song started and the singing drowned out their conversation. But I wonder how you might have answered that toddler that morning. Why are we here? Why are we here this morning and not somewhere else? Why is this church here? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? And those are big questions at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. It's a big question from the mouth of a toddler. But it is an important question. It's an appropriate question at the beginning of a new year when many of us are taking stock of our own lives. It's appropriate to sort of take stock of our congregational life. Why are we here? What are we doing here? It's an appropriate question on a Vision Sunday. Each year at about this time, we try to take some time on a Sunday morning and think about the year in front of us and what God might be inviting us to consider as this new year begins as a congregation. Why are we here? And so this morning we go to this text, which is the public launch of the ministry of Jesus. And it's a bit like having the ministry of Jesus and all of Christianity streaming on our television and taking the remote control and pressing rewind, all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to that very first day when the ministry of Jesus publicly launched. And seeing that here at the launch of Jesus' ministry, Jesus is showing us why He's here, and thus showing us a bit about why we are here as well. So we're just going to walk through this larger text piece by piece and consider some of the ways that God might be inviting us into being and doing for 2023. So in verse 12, Matthew writes, "Now when Jesus had heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali." As part of beginning his ministry, Jesus changes the base of operations from Nazareth to Capernaum. Capernaum had more people. Capernaum was more prominent. Capernaum was a place from which news could spread rapidly as boats crisscrossed the Sea of Galilee, as people traveled the many roads around the Sea of Galilee. There were many villages in this region. Galilee itself was fairly small, 50 miles by 25 miles. And yet, according to Josephus, one ancient historian, there were some 200 villages scattered around this region, each having in the neighborhood of 15,000 people or more. It was one of the more densely populated areas in the Middle East. And so, strategically, intentionally, Jesus moves his base of operations from Nazareth to Capernaum as he begins his ministry. He seems to give some thought about the context in which this ministry is going to launch. He understands the context of Capernaum and and the needs of the people that live there and that live around this region. And so as we begin this new year as a congregation, we might consider, once again, the unique characteristics of and needs of our own Capernaum, Stamford, Connecticut, and the surrounding area. There are many things that we might say about this. We'll just touch on 6 quickly. 1/3 of the households in the Stamford, Connecticut area are described by the acronym ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, and yet still employed, and therefore struggling to afford basic needs. 1/3 of the households in Stamford. 55% of Stamford's renters and 44% of Stamford's homeowners spend more than 1/3 of their income on housing. So a lot of people struggling with basic needs, including housing. The 2020 census was the first time in the history of this city when whites were not the majority population. So increasing diversity here in Stamford. And 1/3 of Stamford's residents were born outside of the United States. The national average is just over 13%, making Stamford, Connecticut uniquely diverse across the United States. This church building itself is located in a census tract where the median family income is $233,000, the highest in Stamford. We compare that to other census tracts, especially those immediately adjacent to I-95 south of here, where the median family income is $69,000 to $84,000. And so we easily see the spectrum of income across these census tracts from south to north here in Stamford. And then finally, food insecurity remains a very significant issue for a large people living in Stamford, Connecticut. So as we consider our own Capernaum and the needs of those who live in this immediate area and this context, that might compel us. It should compel us in this upcoming new year to continue some of the very good work that we're doing right here in the Stamford area. Our monthly meals for Pacific House for homeless men. The basically bi-weekly blood drives that we're hosting now in our facility. Friends Speak, trying to provide conversational English for the many in our community for whom English is not their first language. These are vital ministries providing vital needs here in the immediate Stamford area. And knowing some of these things about our Capernaum might compel us in 2023 to do more to consider how we might partner with other organizations in the Stamford area that we don't really have an official or formal relationship with yet, but that we might as the future moves forward. For example, organizations like Building One Community, who does such good work in the immigrant population. The United Way of Western Connecticut and the Stamford Food Collaborative doing a great deal of work around food scarcity and the provision of food for those in the immediate area. Verse 17, from that time Jesus began to proclaim, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." So as Jesus launches his public ministry, there's some intentional consideration given to this immediate context and the choosing of Capernaum as a base from which to launch that then leads us to consider our immediate context. But there's also this honing of, this sharpening of a message to be shared in this new ministry. And here, according to Matthew, is that message. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. And we might immediately notice what Jesus' message is not as he begins this ministry. His message is not, repent, or you will all go to hell. Repent so that you can all go to heaven. Jesus' good news message is a much more earthly oriented message. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. What Jesus is saying is that in this ministry, as it now launches, heaven is coming to earth. In this new ministry, this corner of the earth is going to look a little bit more like heaven. All of the glory, all of the excellence, all of the love, all of the purity and holiness and godliness of heaven will be making its way down to earth. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. And so Jesus' concern at the beginning of this ministry is not simply the hereafter, getting people off the planet and into the clouds. His concern is the hereafter, the bringing of heaven into every space and heart on earth. And so as we think about 2023 as a congregation, we affirm again that our concern is not merely the hereafter, getting souls into heaven. Our concern is also the here and the now, the spreading of heaven here on earth. And so that message then compels us as we think about this new year as a congregation to continue not only good works that we're doing right here in Stanford, but works that are reaching outside of Stanford, like Shiloh and Hope for Haiti's Children. These are two ministries outside of the Stanford area that are ministering in difficult spaces and doing a very good job in bringing heaven to earth. And so as we move into this year, we reaffirm our commitment to these ministries and the importance of these ministries in the life of this church. But this might also compel us to do some more thinking as we move into 2023. For example, the possibility at some point in the future of partnering with a church planter here in the United States, or a missionary in a foreign country who shares the values of this congregation and in whose work we find our own work multiplied. Again, 2 years into this endeavor, I very clearly see that much of what undergirds this congregation, its desire to be a multi-ethnic space, its desire for gender inclusivity, being an open and affirming congregation and a place where we are learning to live lives of love, that good work needs to be multiplied in a variety of ways so that more of heaven can come down to earth. And some of those ways could be partnering with a church planter here in the United States or with another missionary in a foreign country, looking for ways to expand God's good work here to other places. I think this should also compel us to consider in 2023 ways in which more of us online and here in person, might utilize our own gifts and talents and abilities to bring heaven to earth. There are so many gifts and abilities represented by each person here in this room and by those of you who are part of our online family. And one of the things I would love to see in 2023 is more individuals using your gifts and talents in ministry and service to others. I personally am going to do more to try to enlist more of you in the good work of this church, the good work that's happening in this community, and other good work that God is doing all over this world. I'm going to be inviting you on a monthly basis to consider the month in front of you and to consider what will your monthly ministry be? What intentional ways could you get involved in ministry over the next month that might bring a little bit more of heaven to earth. Verse 18 again. As he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. One of the things that we see at the beginning of Jesus' ministry is the way in which Jesus engages in ministry through community. We can imagine Matthew writing a different story here. We can imagine Matthew writing a story in which Jesus moves from Nazareth and moves into Capernaum and immediately begins doing good deeds that bless the lives of hundreds of people, and he does it all by himself. He does it all alone. He does it solo. But that's not the story that Matthew provides for us. The story that Matthew gives us is a story of Jesus who moves into Capernaum and builds a community, and with that community engages in this world-changing ministry. And so as we consider that reality, that truth, it seems to me that in 2003 we ought to give more consideration concerning the ways in which we also engage in community. Arthur Brooks, in an article in The Atlantic just a few weeks ago, wrote about the way in which through COVID, most of us have learned or relearned how to become disconnected. He called the article "How We've Learned to Be Lonely." Here's some of what he wrote. "The most salient social feature of the pandemic was how it forced people into isolation. For those fortunate enough not to lose a loved one, the major trauma it created was loneliness. Instead of coming together, emerging evidence suggests that we're in the midst of a long-term crisis of habitual loneliness, in which relationships were severed and never reestablished. Many people, perhaps including you, are still wandering alone, without the company of friends and loved ones to help rebuild their life. If your life has not yet gone back to its 2019 era normal, you're not alone." In a poll conducted in March 2022 by the Kaiser Family Foundation, 59% of respondents said they had not fully returned to their pre-pandemic activities. Loneliness, like homelessness or poverty, tends to be self-perpetuating. Much as it is harder to get on your feet once you no longer have a place to sleep and shower, an address, or a phone, social isolation leads to behavior that leads to even more isolation. If you've been seeking remote work instead of in-person work for convenience, choosing solitary activities over group ones because of awkwardness, or electing not to reestablish old friendships because of sheer terror or torpor, you may be stuck in a pattern of learned loneliness. What he's arguing is that as a species over the pandemic, we have learned or relearned how to live in isolation. And that has clearly made its way into the way we practice our spiritual lives. And so perhaps 2023 should be the year when more and more of us take active steps to re-engage in Christian community. Now, for some of us, that might simply mean a greater commitment to being present in one of our online offerings, to just turning off the TV and putting down the book and carving out a time to log in on a Wednesday night or on a Sunday morning. Because that digital connection can be a meaningful connection for people who have learned loneliness. For others of us, 2023 may need to be the year when more frequently we move from our online offerings to our in-person offerings, where we make it at 7 p.m. to a Wednesday night class in person, where we come to a 10 o'clock Sunday morning class in person. And through that face-to-face interaction, we once again experience the joy. Oh, yeah, this is why I like people. This is why I need people. The other thing that we notice at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in that final part of the text is that his first community was intended to be a growing community. Because he promised to take those who are in his community and equip them and inspire them to become fishers of people. Now, in some ways, over the history of American evangelicalism, that phrase, and it's often translated fisher of men, fishers of people is probably a better translation, has come to mean something obnoxious. Well, it's a group of street preachers who are pushing their faith on others and trying to guilt people into the baptistry. That's what fishers of people is. But that's not what Jesus has in mind here. Something that John Williams shared with me last Sunday after service stuck with me, and I think captures a bit of the spirit that Jesus has in mind with this phrase. John was talking to me about what it means to throw someone a line. To throw someone a line. I think that's what Jesus has in mind here. Jesus envisions the creation of a community at the beginning of his public ministry where everybody in that community is constantly throwing someone else a line. Throwing a line to render assistance and aid and help, and slowly pulling that line in so that that other person becomes a part of this ever-growing, ever-expanding community. And I feel like 2023 can finally be a year when more of that is happening in this community. Like every other church around the world, we've survived the beginning of COVID when all it seemed that we could do was just show up, even in a digital space. And then, like virtually every other church around the world, we've gone through sort of a rebuilding phase on the other side of the beginning of COVID, where we finally put some things that were on hold back into place and have started developing a little bit of rhythm and pace. And I think 2023 can finally be the year when enough of that work has happened that we, each individually, can start throwing a line out to our friends, to our family members, personally rendering aid and assistance and slowly pulling that line in so that they too can be part of this community. I mean, it's what Nate did at last night's game night. Nate brought a friend, threw a little line out there. It's what the Johnsons did for our Christmas sing-along, threw a line out to their neighbors and brought them to this event. More and more that can happen in 2023, and more can enjoy God's good work in this good place. True story, happened in Norway a few years ago. Two men, Jens and Jell, were fishing in the Gaula River in Norway. Jens was fishing for salmon, and standing in the middle of the river doing it, slipped and fell. The river was a very swiftly moving river. Jell saw this happen. Jell had fished that river for some 25 years. He knew its corners, its tricks, and as he saw Jens fall into the water and unable to recover himself, Jell knew exactly where to go. And so he sprinted out of that water. He sped down the riverside until he got to this bridge that crossed the river at a strategic place. And he later told a newspaper reporter that he thought Jens was paralyzed because all he could see was the tip of his nose and the tip of his boots as he was going down, rafting down that river. And as Jens was getting closer and closer to the bridge, Jell thought, I'm going to take a chance, and I'm going to cast my line. And sure enough, he did. As the man passed under the bridge, Jell took his line and he just cast it. And out of sheer luck or providence, his lure snagged the rubber waders that Jens was wearing. Now, Jens weighed 250 pounds. And so it took everything that Jell had, every trick that he had learned about fishing, to slowly and carefully bring in this man safely. And finally he did. He hauled in this half-conscious, sputtering, coughing man and saved his life. And the story made all of the local papers. Why are we here? That's why.